Welcome back to History Otherwise, where we explore the paths not taken in history.
It is good to be back. And today we're looking at a path that is, frankly, hauntingly plausible.
It really is. We're taking a deep dive into a scenario that fundamentally changes the world. I mean, right down to the language we're speaking right now.
Yeah.
We've got quite the stack of sources here today. Historical fact sheets, a very detailed narrative of an alternate timeline, and some heavy research references regarding late antiquity. Our mission is to answer one massive question. What if the Roman Empire never left Britain?
It's perhaps the ultimate what if for the English-speaking world. And to tackle this properly, without getting lost, we're going to structure this deep dive into three main parts.
Okay.
First, we have to look at the single critical decision in 410 Anno Domini, the point of divergence that saved Roman Britain from collapse.
Then second, we'll explore how that survival created a unique Latin culture on the island. We're talking about the complete erasure of the English identity before it was even born.
And finally, we'll see how this ancient state, a sort of living fossil, confronts the modern world. We're going to trace this timeline all the way from the Dark Ages to steam engines and the ideologies of the Cold War.
It's a wild ride, but before we get to steam engines, we do need to ground ourselves in the reality. The sources paint a pretty bleak picture of 410 AD in our actual timeline.
Bleak is an understatement. If you look at the fact sheet, the Western Roman Empire is effectively crumbling. You have Emperor Honorius holed up in Ravenna.
He isn't even in Rome.
No, he's hiding in a fortress city surrounded by swamps because he's terrified of Alaric the Goth. The empire is paralyzed.
And meanwhile, in Britain, the locals, the Romano-British, are in a state of absolute panic. The troops have been stripped away over the years by various usurpers to fight civil wars on the continent.
And the Saxons are raiding the coasts.
So the British civitates, the local city councils, they send a desperate letter to Honorius, basically. Help us, send the legions back.
And historically, we know the reply, the rescript of Honorius. It was a short, devastating message. He effectively told the British cities to look to their own defense.
Which is a polite way of saying, you're on your own, good luck.
Exactly. It wasn't a formal independence ceremony. It was an admission of impotence. Rome couldn't help. And that moment kicked off the power vacuum that allowed the Anglo-Saxons to migrate, settle, and eventually create England.
But here's where our narrative source introduces the divergence. A single letter changes everything. In this alternate history, the scene in Ravenna plays out differently.
Yes. Instead of just dismissing the British envoys, Honorius listens to his general, Flavius Constantius. Now, Constantius is described in the research as a pragmatist. He argues that if you voluntarily abandon a province, you're signaling the end of the empire to the whole world. It's a kind of domino theory.
If Britain goes, Gaul goes.
If Gaul goes, Spain goes. Correct. So he convinces the emperor to make a gesture of strength. They can't spare a whole army. I mean, they have Alaric to deal with, but they can spare one legion. The Legio II Augusta.
Now, hold on. The sources say this is about 5,000 men. Is that really enough? I think when you imagine saving Rome, you imagine 100,000 soldiers marching in. How do 5,000 men stop a societal collapse?
That is the key question. And the sources emphasize that this isn't fantasy magic.
Right.
It's about having a strategic nucleus. You have 5,000 professional, heavily armored, disciplined soldiers under a competent commander. In this case, a man named Gaius Valerius Corvus.
So it acts as a rallying point.
Precisely. You have to remember, Britain wasn't empty of soldiers. There were local militias, garrison troops, mercenaries, but they lacked leadership and legitimacy. When Corvus arrives at Richborough, ancient Rutupiae, in 412 AD, he provides that legitimacy.
Okay.
He doesn't try to reconquer the whole island immediately. He consolidates the wealthy southeast and, crucially, the Saxon shore forts. He secures the logistics.
And that leads to the tactical turning point mentioned in the narrative.
A battle of the Wantsum Channel.
Right.
In our timeline, the Saxon raiders just poured in because there was no coordinated naval defense. Here, Corvus uses that single legion and the local militia to ambush a Saxon fleet. They catch them between the shore forts and the Roman navy.
And they crush them.
They do. And the psychological impact is massive. The local warlords, who are starting to carve out their own little fiefdoms, suddenly see that Rome is back. They submit. The office of the Dux Britanniarum, the Duke of the Britons, becomes the real power in the land.
So instead of chaos and the Dark Ages, you get stabilization. But, and this is a crucial detail, the empire on the continent still falls, doesn't it?
It does. Rome still falls in 476 AD. The divergence doesn't save Italy. But by then, Britannia has had 60 years to reorganize itself behind this shield. So when the news arrives that the last emperor has been deposed, Britannia doesn't collapse.
It becomes independent by necessity.
Exactly. And this is where we get into the birth of this Latin nation, because without Rome, they have to decide who they are. And the sources are very clear. They do not become a kingdom.
Which is fascinating.
It is. To a Roman, the word rex king is a dirty word. It implies tyranny. It goes back to the founding of their republic. So when they set up their own state, they reject the idea of a king. They create a republic.
So instead of King Arthur, we get Consul Arthur.
Essentially, yes. Though the sources mention names like Ambrosius Aurelianus, they elect a consul primus, a first consul, for a 10-year term. It's an oligarchy, really, ruled by a council of landowners.
Not a democracy, then.
Oh, not as we'd know it, no. But it certainly isn't a feudal monarchy. Heroes in this timeline are consuls, not kings. Their whole identity is rooted in Rome, not Germania.
It's amazing to think about. We usually associate this era with feudalism, knights, kings. But here you have a state that views itself as the last torchbearer of civilization, run by magistrates and generals. But the biggest change, the one that really messes with my head, is the language.
It's the complete erasure of Englishness. You have to remember, English is a Germanic language brought by the Saxons. If the Saxons are repelled, Old English never takes root.
So no Beowulf, no Chaucer.
No Shakespeare.
Wow.
None of it. The language that develops is described in the notes as Lingua Britannica Vulgaris. It's a Romance language. Think of it as a blend of vulgar Latin and Brythonic Celtic.
Can you give us an idea of what that would sound like?
It would sound something like a mix of Welsh, French, and Spanish. Instead of house, you'd say casa, or maybe tie. Instead of woman, femina. This conversation we're having right now, in this timeline, we'd be speaking a version of Latin.
That is wild, and it goes beyond language, doesn't it? It affects religion, too.
Drastically. In real history, the pagan invasions cut Britain off from the church, and it had to be reconverted later. In this timeline, the Ecclesia Britannica, the British Church, never breaks. It's a unified, distinct Catholic tradition. There's no pagan interlude, no Synod of Whitby.
So you have a society that is Roman in law, Christian in faith, and Latin in speech, the Diocese of Britannia. But surely they can't just sit there peacefully forever. The world keeps turning. And the next big threat on the horizon is the Vikings.
Ah, the Vikings. This is where the military divergence really shines. In our history, the great heathen army rolled over the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms because they were divided. Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, they were all fighting each other.
But here, the Vikings run into a buzzsaw.
They run into a professional standing army, the combatants, the mobile field armies, and a navy, the classis Britannica. The Vikings are raiders, they're opportunistic. If they try to land in Kent and face a disciplined Roman legion backed by a fortified logistical network,
they aren't going to stick around.
They're deflected. The sources suggest they go harder into France and Russia, making those regions much more volatile. But for Britannia, the Vikings are a nuisance, not an existential threat.
And that strength leads to the non-event of the millennium, 1066.
The year that defines English history. William the Conqueror.
And in this role,
William looks across the channel and sees a unified, militarized state with stone roads and a professional navy. He does not invade.
So no Norman conquest.
No Norman conquest, which means no feudalism, no Cathals dotting the landscape, no infusion of French into the language to create Middle English. Britannia remains this maritime oligarchic republic.
It's almost like a supercharged Venice sitting on the edge of Europe. But let's fast forward. We've got this stable, ancient state. How does it handle the New World? Because in our timeline, the English colonies were, well, let's just say chaotic.
Chaotic is fair. They were private ventures, religious dissidents, joint stock companies, very bottom-up. People leaving England to get away from England.
Britannia does not do bottom-up.
No, Rome does state-directed.
Yeah.
When they expand to the New World, into a province they call Vespasiana, roughly our Virginia, it's a military operation, they build Portus Classis, a planned city with a grid structure.
A Roman grid in Virginia? I love that image. But this brings up a massive legal distinction. The sources mention the Codex Britannicus.
Yes, this is crucial. They don't use common law. Common law is the idea of precedent and rights that evolved in England. Judges making law based on previous cases. Britannia uses civil law, Roman law. It's logical, codified, and top-down. The law is what's written in the book.
Which means there is no American Revolution.
Why would there be? The American Revolution was built on the argument that colonists were being denied their rights as Englishmen.
In this timeline, there are no rights of Englishmen.
There's only the duty of the Roman citizen. The population is loyal to the consul. The colonies are just extensions of the provinces.
So you have a massive Latin-speaking territory in North America that is just an extension of the state. But then comes the big disruption, the Industrial Revolution. Now, usually we think of this as merchants and inventors tinkering in sheds, James Watt, that sort of thing.
But not in Britannia. The insight from our sources here is fascinating.
Yeah.
Industry doesn't come from textile merchants looking to sell more cloth. It comes from the fabricae, the state armories.
Explain that connection. How do you get from swords to steam engines?
It's about scale and metallurgy. The state needs to forge armor and weapons for the legions on a massive scale. So they begin using steam power to drive the trip hammers and the bellows. It's the military-industrial complex, but in the 18th century.
So the steam engine is perfected to forge swords, not to spin cotton.
Exactly. And eventually, to power logistics. The sources use the phrase steam-powered eagle. Imagine ironclad dreadnoughts and steam locomotives, but they're serving the military needs of a Roman state.
It's steampunk Rome. But socially, this must be very different from our Industrial Revolution.
Completely. Because it's state-run, you don't get a powerful middle class rising up to challenge the aristocracy. You don't get trade unions. Workers are organized into collegiate state-sanctioned guilds. It's efficient, but it's rigid. The innovation happens, but it's controlled.
Which brings us to the 20th century. This is where the timeline feels really alien. You have this ancient authoritarian republic entering the era of modern ideology.
It's an anomaly. By the 1900s, the rest of the world is turning toward democracy or communism or fascism. Britannia is none of those. It's traditionalist. It's conservative in the literal sense. It wants to conserve the order of Rome.
The sources mention they align with the Latin Entente, France and Italy in World War I.
Yes, against the Germanic barbarians. Old habits die hard. The geopolitical lines are drawn based on ancient cultural affinities rather than modern politics.
And World War II.
The tension really ramps up there. They end up as reluctant allies of the United States. And it's a friction-filled alliance.
Because you have a democracy fighting alongside a stubborn autocracy.
Precisely. The British soldiers, the last legionaries, they aren't fighting for freedom or democracy. They're fighting for pietas, duty, tradition.
That image of a soldier in the 1940s holding a semi-automatic rifle but motivated by a code from 400 BC, it is powerful. It really highlights the difference in mindset.
It does. And after the war, they end up as this lonely, non-aligned power in the Cold War. A relic? They're anti-communist, certainly, because communism threatens the social order. But they aren't part of the free world either. They don't believe in liberal democracy. They are just Rome. Enduring.
So let's unpack what this all means for us. We've painted a picture of a world that is, in many ways, more stable. No chaotic Dark Ages in Britain. No Norman invasion.
But, and this is the big reflection, the paradox.
Go on.
The collapse of Roman Britain in our timeline was a tragedy. It was bloody. It was terrifying for the people living through it. We have records of the groans of the Britons, but that collapse was a necessary precondition for the world we live in today.
Because without that collapse, you don't get the English language.
You don't get English, you don't get common law, and crucially, you don't get the tradition of individual liberty that evolved out of the messy struggles between English kings and their parliaments.
The Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, trial by jury, none of that happens in a Roman Republic.
Exactly. The concept of the individual versus the state is very much a product of that chaotic English history. In the Britannic timeline, the state is everything. Order is everything. You were a citizen, not an individual.
So in a strange way, our world, with its messy democracy, its focus on personal rights, the global dominance of the English language, was only possible because Honorius sent that letter saying no.
That is the trade-off. We lost the order of Rome, but we gained the potential for liberty. That final legion never sailing was the birth of the Anglo-American world.
It really makes you look at bad historical events differently. Sometimes the fall is just as important as the rise.
History is rarely about good or bad. It's about consequences. And the consequences of abandonment were, eventually, us.
That is a lot to think about. We're going to leave you with that thought that you're listening to this in English only because a Roman emperor was too busy to help a distant province.
Indeed.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the last legionary. Make sure to subscribe for more explorations of the paths not taken, because history might have turned otherwise.